Disclaimer, since it's a comparison between the OCG and TCG, I want to say that these are my opinions as someone who has played both formats. I don't speak for every OCG player. The content of this video are my own conclusions that I figured out from playing almost 2 years of OCG. Please do not use this video to discredit any other OCG players' opinions. Thank you. A couple of months ago, I made a video talking about differences between OCG and TCG deck building, but I never uploaded it because I thought it stopped being true during Snake Eyes format. Snake Eyes forced players to adopt heavy hand trap strategies, and then the two formats basically just look the same. However, the meta in the OCG has shifted in such a way that breakers should be good again, and you still can't really commit to a breaker strategy while there have been TCG metas since, such as Rydeel or Yubel formats where main deck breakers have been successfully attempted. Let's look at the 3 Justice Hunter decks. None of them have Omni Negates except for Yummy, I guess, but even in that deck, they don't even always make the Omni Negate because it doesn't stop all of the breakers they care about, such as Super Poly, or Dark Ruler, or Slayer. It doesn't apply to all breakers. Arclight helps a lot against semi-popular breakers such as Raigeki, which otherwise turn into a God Breaker if you don't make an Omni Negate, but it is something to consider that the deck with or without Arclight is susceptible to breakers. K9 is a deck without Omnis. There are probably a lot of breakers that are good, but I'll say for certain that Evenly Matched will do a lot. They'll have the Wolf in graveyard, but they need Izuna in hand or it won't do much. Raigeki would also nuke them now that I'm thinking about it. Dragon Tail. This is another deck where I personally think Evenly Matched is pretty okay. I asked a Dragon Tail player about this close to release, and he said it wasn't that effective because you just self-bounce and then play with hand traps, chainables such as Dimensional Barrier, and then the Spell Negate. So it might depend what deck you're playing as well, and if your deck is weak to Floodgates. Even Malice has breakers that can do something if they combo suboptimally, such as Super Polymerization, because there are good targets such as Garura, or you can even play the Earth Golem at Ignister to kill the Appaloosa and the Egg Code Talker. In general, I would say you lose every single game you have to play a breaker strategy against Malice though. They just draw way too many cards during their combo. The deck's endboard is just extremely layered and has way too much follow-up to give them a second turn. So we've established that breakers are overall pretty good in the current meta with one exception, and the most common hand traps that are used to be played, such as Effect Veiler, are not very good. So why are the vast majority of decks still on main deck hand traps? Even ignoring Dragon Tail, which synergizes much better with Monster Non-Engine, the only breakers among these lists, featured on Road to the King at least, are 2 breakers and Yummy. To be honest, Ghost Bell is basically a breaker, so you can count that as well, but that's a little bit different because it's actionable if you go first. A common sentiment I've seen is that OCG players build to not lose or build to lose less, but they don't build to win, and I understand that this is not meant to be taken literally. The connotation of the sentence is not to say that OCG players have lower IQ and cannot build trying to win the game, but to address that OCG players tend to have deck lists with less engine and are more defensive, and this was something I also thought before I came to the OCG. Although this is true, I think it's a little bit misrepresented in a lot of conversations. Specifically, I feel as if OCG deck building is characterized by 3 qualities. The first one is that it's close to 40 deck size. It will be very rare to see a deck with more than 41 cards. The 3 different options for deck size in the OCG are basically 40 to 41, 60, or branded. The second one is a larger ratio of non-engine, and then the third one are hand traps over breakers in the main. Explaining why OCG players typically play 40 is the least difficult. That's because you have to think, what card could you possibly be adding to your deck that is much better than seeing one of your 6 maxi stops? There are important things to think about, such as your ratio of engine to non-engine and number of normal summons, but most lists can adjust the ratio of the rest of your deck to stay at 40 by compromising some sort of your engine. Explaining the other 2 characteristics is much more difficult. I'm going to be giving a very long anecdote about my experience when I first arrived to the OCG, so please bear with me. For context, I played in the TCG from Power of the Elements to Cyberstorm Access, and when I started playing in the OCG, Age of Overlord was already out. The decks I played in the TCG were decks with larger engines such as Hero, Tier, Plants, and Runic combo variants. Also Purely, but that deck's engine isn't as large as the others. The reason is that when you play with a larger engine, typically it means you either have more access to your engine, or your engine has more tools to answer various situations, and I always thought the most fun part of Yu-Gi-Oh! Was when you could figure out how to navigate different game states with your engine. Breaking boards with engine going second is my personal favorite experience playing current. Of course, you're not playing zero non-engine, but it just feels like when you need non-engine as a necessity instead of a supplement, then it almost feels like draw the out gameplay, which I never liked. And that's why when people always compared Mathmech and Plants, I understand the comparison because they have strong one-card starters, and you probably lose a lot of game to them when you don't have non-engine, but I never felt the comparison was fair because I always thought Mathmech was cringe, but Rika wasn't because Mathmech's engine was so small, and part of its end board was he'd still draw into 2 hand traps. When I first arrived to the OCG, the meta was Rescue Ace, Tearlaments, Labyrinth, Branded, and Purely. If you're familiar with these decks, then it's probably immediately obvious that this is a collection of decks that plays well into Maxi, or is Tearlaments which just has a million fans. This is tier without Kickalist, by the way, so it definitely has problems with Maxi, but I wasn't thinking about this at all. I just wanted to play a deck I thought was strong enough that wasn't popular, which was Rickus and Avalon. European duelists such as Sunseed Jess have been showing Europe why the deck is so strong, and I saw no reason why I couldn't just show the OCG the Sunny Seed. I personally hit Master 1 very easily with Rika, so I thought it would translate well, but Master Duel is just not representative of the OCG. It seems like it should be because of Maxi, but the difference between best of 3 and best of 1 is immense, and that's also why when you look at a best of 1 tournament such as YCSJ, decks such as Tempai do well when it's otherwise extinct. The very first day I walked into a locals and tried to purchase a deck, this was my very first attempt at an OCG deck. The shop owner actually asked me if I was a TCG player based on my list, and I was surprised because I didn't think there was anything that would have given me away. I have all the Maxi stops in there, so it looked like a normal OCG deck to me. And that's when the store owner and another one of my friends tried to explain to me that OCG players don't build with fields that, directly translated, try to crush the opponent to death turn 1. They enjoy a back and forth. And these were the words that confused me because I feel like the reason why OCG players do this wasn't that clear to me at the time. At first, I thought they meant that OCG players were just trying not to win and letting their opponent play for fun. And that was a poor assumption I had made because the reason they play it back and forth wasn't obvious to me at the time. The main problem they had with my specific list was the number of hand traps and the small worlds. For a deck of my size, my non-engine was a bit low ratio-wise, and they did not like the small worlds because the way they explained it was that I'm 2 for 1ing myself, so it's a neg-1. And as a TCG player, I really didn't understand because the loci goes plus 10 by itself, so I didn't see why the minus mattered. So I was trying to have a discussion with them on this, and that's when a different one of my friends told them to just let me try it out, and then eventually I'll understand. And he was right. Within 3 locals, I understood. Essentially, I played 3 Thrust because Thrust was a very efficient card. If you drew it going second, you can search for a starter or a breaker, and if you drew it going first, then you could just convert it into an imperm. Now, Thrust in the TCG was good because playing breakers and Ricko was very efficient. It's kind of like Branded. They have massive engines, so playing some hand traps is a bit low impact. And it's hard to break all good boards without any non-engine. So they play a breaker approach, especially because their going first board is so strong that they basically just win going first and use breakers going second. This logic doesn't really apply to the OCG because main decking breakers is very inconsistent. I think this is mainly due to 3 reasons. The first one is that the OCG has more turn skips. This isn't as relevant as before because Maxi is only at 2 copies now, but if you main deck board breakers, you'll draw them going first and get Charmed, which means you'll be short card activity when you play with a compromised board. That's why one of the only decks I've ever seen consistently main decking breakers since I got here was Tempai, because it wants to blind second always. If you have breakers and went first, but got Maxied, then you basically just wait to die. The second reason is that the OCG plays more hand traps in general, as a result of turn skips and almost every deck main decking both 2 called bys and 1 crossout. There are TCG formats with similar amounts of hand traps, but in general I would say the TCG is more capable of shifting its non-engine away from hand traps if it suited the meta, and that means it's more likely that you get stopped in the OCG, especially if you're cutting extenders for hand traps. Other players maining hand traps also encourages you to play more hand traps because you would otherwise be missing an interaction on the hand trap war. This is also why my friends really hated Small World in my Ricka list. The -1 isn't important because it can't be recovered by the search. It's important because if you're stopped at any point and had to pay a hand trap for the Small World, you're going to be short in interaction. That's also why my testing group keeps telling me to cut the 2 sign-up minings in my Malice list for 2 more cats instead, but I just keep them because I want to play through Lancia more. The third reason is the OCG endboards have higher ceiling. The OCG ban list is more lax, and that means stronger endboard monsters as well as floodgates are legal. Here is an example. Breakers were briefly popular in my region when Tenpai was released because that deck blinded second. So I won a box tournament by playing this Lightsworn tier list, which would have Naturia Beast as part of the end board. Their only out was Droplet and another Breaker, but that still loses to Scream, Soliak, Kaleidoheart, Planet, and then making Stapelia or Window on their turn, and also having Snow and Mudora in the graveyard. The end board was just way too big for Breakers to ever be an efficient strategy, so I would just farm all the Tenpai players if they didn't open Maxi. Here's an example of an Earth Grass pile I played against at locals, where the goal is to turbo out Natria Synchros next to some negates. And here's a Pendulum player I actually lost to that made Appaloosa, IP, Barone with Maxi, the Battle Protect Pendulum, and Fossilzina. And this was kind of the harsh reality I needed to realize when I started to play the OCG, which is that if you play a deck of mostly engine, you cannot consistently win. When you play the TCG, I don't want to say it's impossible to lose to a rogue deck, but just from my experience playing Dueling Book, the power level of rogue decks is much lower, and that means that in order for them to beat you, if you're actually playing a strong deck, even if you drew 5 engine, you could try and push through the rogue decks versus the OCG where you're staring down Barone, IP, Appaloosa, and then more. Before coming to the OCG, I also thought I could bring some TCG player logic because Master Duel had tricked me into thinking it applied a lot more than it does. If you're playing 6+ rounds of matches, then you naturally just start realizing more non-engine, more hand traps, although it feels bad, tends to be the most consistent strategy. 2 out of 3 siding just eliminates the variance that a large engine maxi ignoring deck would produce, and that means in tournament you end up paired against exclusively large hand trap decks as long as you keep winning, and if you're not playing that type of deck yourself, you're just going to have bad matchups. That's because there is basically no such thing as a deck that has extenders and also plays through all turn skips. The closest you ever got was Ryzeal. Yummy, Memento, and Dragontail are pretty close, or it had to be a deck that is extremely low power. This might sound obvious, but in my opinion, OCG deck building tends to perform best in the OCG, and TCG deck building tends to perform best in the TCG. There are many smart players everywhere in the world, and they will usually figure out the best strategy for their own environments. I personally still build my TCG list for Dueling Book ladder very similar to other TCG players, even though my OCG lists look very similar to what other OCG players conclude. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking what I'm saying isn't really grounded in reality because OCG players main deck Charmies, and Charmies suffer from the same weaknesses as Breakers. That's true, for the most part, but they're distinct in that a very common play is to drop turn skips in draw phase to play around talents. And if that happens and you have Charmies in hand, you can choose to pass and still get value on them as opposed to Breakers that don't do anything. Another counter argument against my theory is that there have been topping deck lists with Breakers. 2 that I'm thinking of are Snake Eyes main decking Droplet very often during LEDE format, and Orcus frequently main decking Super Polymerization. The issue is that these 2 examples are of Breakers that can be used going first and second, so these cards don't suffer from the same problems that you get with inactive cards. But we can talk about some other examples as well because it does happen sometimes. 2 successful examples of main decking only going second Breakers are Tenpai and Flu. But the main reason is because they don't suffer from the reasons I outlined earlier. Flu is a deck that previously rarely got turn skipped because they aren't affected by Maxi or Shifter, which meant unless they got drolled, they were most likely going to accomplish their board. There were exceptions, like if they had a very weak hand with no map or advent or no way to banish a bird, then an Ash or Inperm could stop them. But in general, they would play going first. And then going second, the deck's engine was quite incompetent at breaking boards unless the opponent just sat there AFK and let you Flowing Winds Rise Attribute their whole board. It was difficult, and Breakers had better synergies with the pot cards they were playing as well. Tenpai is a deck that blinded second, so Breakers were only bad when your opponent knew you were on Tenpai and then sent you first. I have also personally tested main deck Breakers since. I had this Memento list, which looks awful, but was a list I actually did play during Alliance Insight format. At the time, I thought Imperm was weak because it didn't do much to Malice, and I only ever wanted to draw 1 copy against Ryzeal at most, but I might as well just play the one since every list was on them, so I still had it as a crossout target. I also thought that Memento was a deck that wasn't weak to any turn skips except for Shifter, and you had a Maxi compromise as well. Of course, there were 2 games I lost because I had to start with Seahorse and had no Maxi stop, and then I can't access my compromise, so I just die with Slayer in hand. But that's just going to happen sometimes when you play the OCG. There are a lot of people who share ideas from a place of constructive criticism or curiosity, But there are also those who speak confidently about OCG players being inferior and how TCG players would break the OCG instantly if forced to play it. I guess I'm making this video because I'm getting one guide, but there are a lot of one guys, and I see these comments all the time. Asking why the OCG doesn't do things is good. Asserting that OCG players don't know how to win their own format is not good. I'm also not saying that the TCG never figures out things that OCG players don't. Two examples I'm thinking of right now are Water and Jacklab. When Poseidra came out, I remember people trying the deck out, but it didn't really go anywhere. But Mermail has been consistently a strong deck in TCG for a while. Even though we don't have Toad, the deck is still very playable, and I'm seeing a lot more players playing the deck recently, to the point where you should probably expect to see one when you go to locals now, and I don't think that's unrelated to the TCG success. Another is Jacklab. When Dinka Bui first topped with Jacklab, I remember being really excited and telling people at my locals, I think the deck is really good, and it fixes almost every problem I have with Labyrinth. And one of my friends said this type of list wasn't suited for an OCG environment, and then it started topping. And I would even say it's a pretty popular way to play the deck in OCG now. Now, to be fair, one of these tops is Jack Joe, so it's the same player in the TCG and the OCG, but other players are playing it as well. Personally, I still think it's possible you could index heavier into a Breaker Yummy strategy because the Yummy turn skip compromise is quite good. I've been testing one to average success. It's not going as well as I had hoped, to be honest, but it's one of my last two considerations for the format along with Malice. But that's partially why I keep making videos and asking for feedback, because I think people from all regions have great ideas that we can share with each other. But I just hope if you're someone that thinks OCG players are too primitive, that often the more likely explanation is that the difference in our formats is why we haven't adopted successful TCG lists. So please, don't make comments about how we're too dumb to figure out Ryzeal Fiendsmith or Striker Yummy or whatever. A lot of times we are trying these ideas and they either don't top or we just physically cannot build these decks due to our ban lists.